Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me today at Courageous Journeys. Today's topic is why I stayed. This started as a social media campaign after a professional football player was caught on video hitting his wife and knocking her unconscious. And I know it seems I'm a little late to this, but I thought that I would do this for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is October of every year. So, for this year, in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I am hoping to share stories of women who have found themselves in abusive relationships and stayed. Whether you stayed a week or you stayed 30 years, the truth is that for most people who find themselves being in an abusive relationship, most of us do stay. It's actually quite rare that you will meet somebody who was in a relationship with somebody and there was an abuse incident and they just left. In part because it tends to escalate. It kind of starts, the behavior will start sometimes as controlling behavior or some passive aggressive like name calling and teasing and that sort of thing. And then it sometimes progresses. Not all the time, sometimes it stays in that way. And just for however long you have the relationship, but sometimes it does escalate. But even when there's physical violence, rarely is that ever the first incident of abuse. So I'm asking people to share their stories of why they stayed. And throughout the month, I'm going to be sharing those stories in part to provide hope to people who are in the situation or who might find themselves in the situation, to know that they're not alone, but also to provide support. Because one of the things that abuse does is create a huge sense of isolation. And the more isolated you feel, the less likely you are to leave. And so I want people to understand that you are not alone. You are not the only one who is going through this. And in knowing that, you can't tell yourself that it's happening because you deserve it. Because then you would also be saying that every other woman it happens to deserves it. And I'm pretty confident you wouldn't believe that. So, since I'm asking people to share themselves in such a personal way and public way, you can be anonymous, by the way, if you want to share your story. But I thought that I should share mine as well. So, that's what I'm going to do. I, like most people who have a history of childhood abuse, have found myself in very unhealthy, abusive relationships. And I say, like most people who have a history of abuse, from my experience, I would say probably 85%, maybe even higher. People aren't always honest about the nature of their relationships or about their abuse history, which is okay. But about 85 to 90% of the people that I've worked with, or even know personally, who have a history of abuse, have also found themselves in an abusive relationship. That's not a coincidence. Unfortunately, it's not a coincidence at all. It's not as if it wasn't enough to be abused as a child and then you have to find yourself in a similar circumstance as an adult. But that's a different issue. So, why I stayed. As I was thinking about doing this video, I was kind of thinking, okay, I need to come up with a list of all the different reasons why I stayed. And first of all, it didn't feel really natural to me. But I recognize that for me, it's like most people, I believed I was unworthy of anything more than an unhealthy relationship. I believed that I didn't deserve to be in a completely healthy relationship. I didn't believe that there was anybody out there who wouldn't abuse somebody who would be interested in me. And like most abusive relationships, there were good parts. which is part of what really makes it difficult to leave, because you hold on to those good parts. And for me, anyway, generally, the parts that were good were parts that I never imagined I would be able to experience. And so, while I expected to not be in a healthy relationship, which is what I was getting, I didn't expect the good to be as good as it was. And so, in my mind, I rationalized that it was better to have that good than to not have it. So even if I were not in that relationship, I would inevitably find myself in another relationship that was abusive, but the likelihood of having those good, really good parts probably wouldn't be there. So I was better off staying in that, or in those kinds of relationships. So at a core, believing that I was unworthy of anything better. And because of that unworthiness, also believing that it happened because of me, because of who I was, because I wasn't good enough, because I wasn't lovable enough. But all of that is part of that unworthiness. And of course, when you're treated in a way, well, in an abusive way, it only reinforces that you're not enough, that you're unworthy. And so it becomes this horrible cycle of continuing to find proof, so to speak, that you really are unworthy. Additionally, at a point, I had children involved. And I know that most people think, well, when you have children, you'll do anything to protect them. And I absolutely agree with that. But in my mind, and I think this is true for a lot of women, because I believed that I was so unworthy, and I believed that I was not good enough, I believed I was not a good enough mother. And that even though that bad part was there in the relationship, that my children were better off because they had somebody else besides me, because I wasn't good enough. That they were better off having this person, these people around, even though I was being abused and mistreated, because otherwise it would have just been me, and then they were just going to be screwed because I had nothing to offer them. And while I know that that's not true now, I believed that at the time. I believed that because those good parts were there, that those parts far outweighed and were so much better as a parenting aspect than I could ever be as a single mother. And of course, like most people who are in abusive relationships, I rationalized the behavior. Well, the kids never saw anything. I wouldn't cry around them, or I'd try not to, kind of telling myself, being in denial about the fact that maybe they knew what was happening. And they were young at the time. So lots of different ways to rationalize and minimize the abuse, going back to those coping skills, which we do so easily. So those are I'm going to call them excuses. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I'm going to call them excuses because those were all the things that I could point to and identify as to why I should stay, when the reality was that I stayed because I didn't believe that I deserved any better, that I would ever be able to find anything any better, because anybody who would be better would never love me. So, and I was able to believe that you could love somebody and abuse them at the same time, which is something that we learned being a childhood survivor as well. So, I hope that in sharing my story, maybe there's something you can actually connect with, and see that there's so many different reasons why we stay, and we cannot judge people for their decisions. We can only support them and be there for them when they do make the decision to leave, to help build their sense of worthiness and see their internal strength to know they can do it on their own. I know now that the things that I believed at the time were not accurate perceptions of reality. I know that it was my belief system that was keeping me in that situation. It's also that belief system that causes you to be drawn to people who are likely going to be abusive. Doesn't mean that you are the cause. It doesn't mean that you deserve it. It doesn't mean it's your fault that it happens. But when you believe that you're unworthy, you tend to be drawn to people who reinforce that idea. That's just a fact. So, I hope this has been helpful to you in whatever way. Maybe even helping you realize that sometimes when you look at somebody, it's easy to think, oh, their life must be perfect. They've never had anything bad, and wouldn't that be nice to live that way? I'm not sure that that happens for any of us. And the reason I do this work is because I share so many of the same types of experiences, doubts, fears, feelings, beliefs, as so many of you out there. So, if you're interested in sharing your story, and I hope that you will consider doing that, you don't have to have left the relationship to share your story, but send me an email, po@courageousjourneys.com. Send me an email with hashtag whyIstayed, share your story, and also give me permission, written permission, to share your story on my blog. And I will be sharing stories throughout the month of October. It's a way to help people feel connected and supported, and maybe even provide a little hope along the way. Be part of that with me, sharing hope to people who are struggling. Thanks for joining me, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.